My son Anton believes I died 40 years ago. His mother, my late wife, sent me only one letter while I was in prison. I told him you died in a car accident. It'll be easier for him to grow up that way. All these years, I remained a ghost to him, to protect him from the truth. I served my time for an armed robbery that ended in murder. I didn't pull the trigger, but the blood is on my hands. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Leonid Abramson. I was 68 years old when the prison gate opened. I had been a welder before everything went to hell, a quiet man with a steady hand and a knack for fixing things no one else could. For 40 years, I hadn't seen the open sky without barbed wire framing it. Now, standing just outside the Federal Correctional Facility in Arizona, I was free. At least that was what they told me. The sun hit me like a slap. It was too bright, too loud. I squinted, instinctively raising my hand as if to shield myself from something more than sunlight, maybe from time itself. My eyes watered, not from emotion, but from that pure, dry desert light. The world beyond the gate looked oversaturated, like someone had turned the color knob on a television all the way up. Everything screamed color: the blue of the sky, the orange of the road signs, the white flash of passing cars. I had one plastic bag in my hand. Inside were my prison release papers, a folded copy of my birth certificate, a used pair of jeans 2 sizes too big, and a stack of bills totaling $80. They'd given me a prepaid bus card and a list of shelters. The shoes on my feet had soles so thin I could feel the gravel through them. They weren't mine. Nothing I wore was mine. Not anymore. I stepped forward, one foot onto the asphalt. It was strange to walk without watching the backs of guards. I kept expecting a voice to shout my name, to tell me this was a mistake, to order me back behind the wire. But the voice never came. Only the sound of a teenager's electric skateboard buzzing past, the boy's silhouette vanishing before I could even fully register it. The world had changed, and I hadn't. I tried to walk like I belonged out here, but my body betrayed me. I hunched slightly, shoulders curled inward. Years of institutional posture, never too tall, never too confident, always careful. I scanned the highway like I was checking for snipers. Cars blurred past me, each one a bullet of noise and speed. I hadn't seen traffic like that in decades. Even the smallest things felt foreign. The way people held their phones like lifelines, the way they never looked up, the way the world moved too fast for someone like me. I walked a little down the road, just far enough that the prison gate disappeared behind me. The weight of it remained. I didn't know where I was going exactly. My release plan said I should head to Phoenix, but I didn't know Phoenix. I didn't know anywhere anymore. The cities I remembered were gone. Their names remained, but their faces had changed. A rusted bench outside a gas station became my first stop. I sat, more from habit than fatigue. In prison, you learned to rest when you could. I looked at my hands, rough, gnarled things with scars I couldn't name anymore. Once these hands had welded steel frames and repaired industrial boilers. They had wiped blood from my temple the night everything fell apart. They had been cuffed behind my back and clenched through 40 winters. Now they trembled as I unfolded the bus pass. I watched people come and go from the gas station. No one looked at me. I was just another old man sitting in the heat, waiting for a bus that might never come. And maybe I was. I didn't even know the exact time anymore. I had no phone, no watch. Time had become a guess, a vague feeling in my bones that the day was passing, that the light was shifting. I stood up again and walked toward the corner. There was a metal post with bus route information, but the numbers meant nothing to me. I had no address to reach, No contact waiting. The parole officer said to call if I got lost, but I didn't want to call. I didn't want to hear another voice with clipped patience explaining what to do next. I was tired of being told what to do. I had earned the right to be lost. I walked a little more. A strip mall appeared on the horizon, its sign buzzing with half-lit letters. I recognized the names: fast food chains, dollar stores, cell phone outlets. But they felt like relics from an alternate universe. I hadn't stood in a shopping center since Carter was president. I hadn't tasted a burger in 4 decades. I had no appetite for it now. Hunger felt different after years of institutional trays and plastic forks. I kept walking, 1 block at a time, my eyes adjusting slowly to the noise, the movement, the everything. I stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the light. Cars hummed beside me. The walk sign flashed, and I crossed with the rest of the crowd. They didn't see me. Not really. I could have been a ghost drifting through their digital lives. Maybe that's all I was now. A man who had disappeared before the internet, re-emerging in a world run by screens. I reached the edge of a public park. Dry grass, dusty swings, a cracked basketball court. I sat on a bench in the shade of a drooping tree. A child laughed in the distance. That laugh pierced me deeper than any courtroom sentence ever had. It reminded me of another laugh, one I hadn't heard since a boy named Anton sat on my shoulders in a backyard, long gone. The wind shifted. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined I was back there, before the sirens, before the shattered glass, before the blood, just a father holding his son, the sun on his back, the smell of summer in the air. But when I opened my eyes, it was just this dry Arizona afternoon, and I was alone on a bench, waiting for something I couldn't name. The sun dipped slightly. I stood again, body aching. Freedom, they said. But freedom wasn't light or joy or release. It was weight, heavy, complicated, unfamiliar. It came with no map, no instructions, just silence and memory, and the long, slow work of trying to exist in a world that had moved on without you. I walked toward the sidewalk. My shoes scraped the pavement with every step. There was no destination yet, no place to belong. But I was moving. After 40 years, that was all I could do, 1 step at a time. Toward what? I didn't know, but away from the gate, away from who I had been, and maybe, if I was lucky, toward something that still had a name. The probation office was tucked behind a strip mall, hidden between a pawn shop and a payday loan place. There was no sign, just a worn-out door with a buzz-in speaker and a laminated list of office hours. I pushed it open and was hit with a wave of artificial air and fluorescent light. The waiting room smelled like dust, disinfectant, and tired souls. Plastic chairs lined the walls, bolted to the floor. A mounted TV played a daytime courtroom show with the volume off. A woman with smeared mascara chewed her nails. A young man in an ankle monitor tapped his foot, checking his phone every 30 seconds. No one spoke. I took a seat in the corner and clutched my papers like they were something sacred. They weren't. Just a release form, a list of conditions, and a schedule for reporting in person twice a week. I had memorized the rules already. Curfew at 8 p.m., no travel outside county lines, no alcohol, random drug tests, maintain employment or prove effort, don't associate with felons, don't carry weapons, don't disappear. My name was called by a disembodied voice behind a bulletproof window. I rose slowly, my knees still stiff from the long walk that morning. Behind the glass, a man in a tan dress shirt gestured toward the door to the side. I followed the hallway and entered a small office with mismatched chairs and a metal desk stacked with files. My probation officer barely looked at me. He had the air of someone who'd seen 1,000 versions of me and stopped expecting surprises. He ran through the conditions again, clicking through a computer system while speaking in a voice as flat as the desert outside. I signed form after form, the pen slick in my calloused hand. When he asked for an ID, I had nothing to give, just my birth certificate, yellowed and bent at the corners, and a prison ID they had made me surrender. I told him I would apply for a state-issued card right away. He handed me a referral slip for the DMV and a list of acceptable documents, most of which I did not have. Afterward, I walked 2 blocks to the Government Assistance Center, hoping to get things moving. The line stretched out the door. Inside, the air was thick with impatience. I took a number and waited for over an hour under flickering lights and the drone of whispering arguments. When it was finally my turn, I stepped up to the counter and tried to explain my situation. The woman behind the glass didn't blink. Her voice was practiced, tired. She asked for proof of address. I gave her the name of the halfway house I had been assigned, but she needed something printed. A lease, a utility bill, a bank statement. I had none. She pointed to a printed sheet with bold text that said, "Required documents for state identification." I stared at it, my chest tightening. Everything they needed was something I didn't have. Everything they asked for assumed a life that existed on paper. Rent contracts, employment history, bills in my name. I didn't even have a cell phone. I left with nothing, not even a temporary card. The streets outside were buzzing with people who all seemed to know where they were going. I didn't. I walked to the shelter listed on my papers. The entrance was flanked by a man arguing with a security guard and a woman sobbing into a plastic bag. Inside, the intake worker handed me a cot assignment and a voucher for a sandwich. I thanked her, even though the room I entered felt more like a storage hall than a place for sleep. The bed creaked when I sat on it. The man next to me coughed into his sleeve for 5 minutes straight. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of the noise, but because my mind wouldn't stop folding in on itself. In the morning, I returned to the DMV. The line was even longer. I waited again, this time with a utility form provided by the shelter. The clerk was young, maybe 20. He typed slowly and frowned at his screen, then asked me to wait. He left and came back with a supervisor. They spoke softly while glancing at me. Eventually, the supervisor told me I was flagged. Too many gaps in my record. My social security number had been suspended and needed reactivation. I asked how long that would take. She shrugged. They told me I could still fill out the application, but it wouldn't be processed until the background was resolved. I filled it out anyway. I didn't know what else to do. After that, I walked back to the shelter. A flyer taped to the wall near the entrance advertised free meals at a church soup kitchen 5 blocks away. I followed the map with my finger and set off. At the church, I stood in line with dozens of others, men with haunted eyes, women holding toddlers, teens with backpacks and 1,000-yard stares. The volunteers served chili and white bread with butter. I said thank you and meant it. I sat at a folding table and ate in silence. Later that afternoon, I went to a workforce development center. It was loud, crowded, filled with computer terminals and impatient job counselors. I took a seat at a terminal and stared at the screen. A woman came over and helped me log in. The job board was filled with listings that required things I didn't have: references, recent employment, driver's license, online access. I opened a few applications and froze every time I reached the section about criminal background. The box was always there. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? I clicked away each time. By evening, my legs ached. I went back to the shelter, where my cot was still marked with a slip of paper that read, Leonid A. I lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. I felt like a ghost. I existed in the eyes of the state only through paperwork that said I had done something wrong. There was no documentation of the man I was trying to become, just checkboxes, regulations, and quiet reminders that I didn't belong here. Not in the system, not in the world that had moved on. The next day, I went to a second center to try again. The intake worker there smiled kindly, but told me the same thing. No ID, no progress. Without the right forms, I couldn't access anything. Not a job, not food stamps, not medical care. Every solution was behind a locked door, and the key was made of paper I didn't have. I walked for hours after that, past murals and parking lots and vacant buildings, past cafes where young people sat with laptops and smooth coffee cups. I stopped at a public library, hoping I could at least use the restroom and rest. I wandered the aisles of books, trailing my fingers along spines. Fiction, non-fiction, history. I had missed the rise and fall of entire empires while locked away. I had missed the invention of the internet, the fall of the towers, the election of presidents, the birth of my son's adulthood. I sat at a table and took out the crumpled sheet listing everything I needed. Proof of residence, proof of identity, proof of work, proof of existence. That last part wasn't printed, but it was understood. The world didn't see me until I could prove I was real. I was a man without evidence, a man who had lived for 40 years in a place that didn't count. And now that I had been released, I wasn't free. I was invisible, a paper man, flimsy, crumpled, almost transparent. I folded the sheet and put it back in my pocket. It was the only proof I had that I was even trying. The room I was assigned to at the re-entry center was small enough that when I lay on the bed, I could touch both walls with my hands. The mattress dipped in the middle, and the pillow smelled faintly of antiseptic. A single metal shelf held the few items I owned: a pair of socks, a folded undershirt, my documents in a plastic sleeve, and a cheap burner phone I had picked up from a corner store with the last of the stipend money they gave me upon release. The phone was the kind with oversized buttons and no internet. It wasn't meant for anything other than basic calls and texts, which suited me fine. I wasn't interested in apps or screens or the illusion of connection. I only needed it for one thing, and I had been avoiding that one thing for days. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone heavy in my palm. My thumb hovered over the keypad, shaking slightly. I had memorized the number years ago, then burned it into my memory every day of every year since. It was written on the back of a faded photograph I kept in my wallet, the ink smeared from time and sweat. The picture showed a younger version of me with a boy on my shoulders, bare feet, gap-toothed smile, sunlight streaking across his hair. That boy was my son. His name was Anton. I hadn't seen him in over 4 decades. His mother had sent me one letter during my sentence. In it, she told me she had told Anton I had died. In a car crash. No details, just a story she thought would protect him. She wrote, "It will be easier for him this way." I read that sentence 1,000 times in the dim light of my cell until the words lost shape. Now, I was out, and he was a man. I pressed the power button on the phone. The screen lit up in blue. I scrolled through the empty contacts list and entered the number manually, digit by digit, as if summoning something from the past. My finger trembled as I hit the green call button. The phone rang. With each ring, my heart tightened. I had rehearsed what I would say too many times, and now I couldn't remember any of it. The silence between the tones felt endless. I imagined him answering in a deep voice I wouldn't recognize. I imagined him hanging up the moment I said my name. I imagined worse. Then the ringing stopped. Someone answered. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My lips parted, but nothing came out. The silence was thick on both ends. I heard background noise, distant, like television or voices in another room. Then came a single word, spoken by a woman. I didn't understand it. A name, maybe. Then another voice, male, sharp, curt, impatient. My name wasn't spoken. I stayed on the line, mute, listening. A question was asked. I recognized it as a "Who is this?" But the tone was already cold, defensive. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry. The moment I had waited for had arrived, and I was paralyzed. I finally tried to speak, but the first sound caught in my throat. It came out too soft, almost inaudible. On the other end, I heard something that sounded like a scoff, followed by silence. Then the line went dead. He had hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand as if it had betrayed me. The call hadn't lasted 20 seconds, and it had broken something in me I didn't know was still intact. I looked down at the screen. No callback, no message, just the time flashing back at me like nothing had happened. I set the phone down on the bed, gently, like it was made of glass. My hands dropped to my lap. My shoulders sagged. A warmth rose in my face, the kind that comes before shame settles in your chest and makes a home there. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just sat still, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant traffic outside the barred window. Eventually, I picked up the photograph again. The colors had faded to the point where it looked like a memory more than an image. I traced the outline of Anton's face with my thumb. There was a time when I could recall the sound of his laugh just by looking at that picture. Now I wasn't sure if I was remembering him, or just the version I wanted to believe had existed. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I thought about all the men I had met inside, how many of them had kids who never answered, or never called, or never even knew. There were so many ghosts walking the prison yards, fathers in name only, forgotten by time and family. I had no right to expect a welcome. I knew that. I had disappeared from his life before he could speak in full sentences. All he had were the stories told to him, and none of those stories had room for the truth. I was a blank page someone else had written on. And now I was trying to scratch out ink that had dried decades ago. The silence in the room was unbearable. It wasn't the kind that comforted. It pressed down like a lid, heavy and final. I sat up again and looked at the phone. I debated calling again, this time prepared to speak, but I knew I wouldn't. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. That door had been slammed shut, and I had stood outside it like a beggar with no voice. The next morning, I left the room early and walked aimlessly through the neighborhood. I needed to move, to make my body forget what had happened. But the sound of the deadline echoed with every step. I wandered past bus stops and empty storefronts, past families unloading groceries, past teenagers laughing on their phones. I kept my head down. No one looked at me. At a diner, I bought a cup of coffee and sat by the window. I watched cars pass, trying to imagine where they were going. Somewhere with laughter, somewhere with pictures on the wall, somewhere with voices that answered the phone. The coffee tasted bitter, but I drank it all. When I finished, I stood up and walked back into the same world I had left 40 years ago. Only now, I knew with certainty that my name had no place in it. I was a voice from the grave that no one wanted to hear. A dial tone, an echo, a man who had tried to call home and realized too late that there was no home to call. I woke before the sun most days, though there was nothing to wake for. The room was the same every morning, dim, stale, too still. I sat on the edge of the cot, laced up the worn sneakers someone had left in the donation bin, and folded my blanket tight, just as I had done for 40 years. The muscle memory remained. In prison, that simple act marked the beginning of another day, survived. Out here, it marked nothing. There was no count, no bell, no routine, just silence and an endless stretch of unknown. The city loomed outside like a living thing, too large to understand, too fast to follow. It didn't breathe with me. It moved in a language I no longer spoke, but I stepped into it every day because I had to. The rules were clear. Find work, or prove you were trying. And so I tried. I walked the blocks with a crumpled list of addresses in my pocket and a folder of copied documents tucked under my arm, like armor that wasn't nearly strong enough. The first place I went was a hardware store. The manager glanced at my clothes before even looking at my face. He asked for my resume. I didn't have one. I had work history, but not on paper. Welding, repairs, construction, 40 years ago. He handed me a form and told me to fill it out. I sat on a plastic chair by the door and got as far as the question, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" I froze. I stared at that line for so long, the ink on the pen started to fade from the pressure of my grip. I left it blank. I folded the paper, left it on the seat, and walked out, without a word. The next place was a fast food chain. They had a kiosk where you applied on a screen. I didn't know how to use it. I touched the wrong buttons, opened menus I couldn't close, stared at icons that meant nothing to me. A teenager in a headset watched me struggle and eventually asked if I needed help, but I saw the smirk behind his politeness. I stepped aside, pretending to take a call, and walked out again. I went to a warehouse office next. The man at the desk handed me an application and told me to wait. I sat in a cracked plastic chair under a blinking light. An hour passed, then 2. Eventually, a woman called out names from a clipboard. Mine wasn't on it. I approached her, and she told me they were only hiring those with recent forklift certification. I had once operated forklifts before she was born, but that didn't count. She pointed me toward another office 10 blocks away that might take people for general labor. I walked the 10 blocks in the heat. My shirt stuck to my back. My legs ached. The city seemed to twist with each step. Streets that looked familiar doubled back on themselves. Construction blocked sidewalks, horns blared, and people brushed past me as if I didn't exist. I passed coffee shops filled with bright-eyed people typing on laptops, joggers in expensive shoes, children with backpacks laughing into phones. I was moving through a world built without me. At the next place, a factory outlet, the foreman was out. "Come back next Tuesday." I nodded, thanked him. I didn't know what day it was. I walked to a bench outside and sat with my documents in my lap. They felt heavier with each rejection. My ID still hadn't arrived. The paper temporary one was wrinkled and already fading. I made a list of everywhere I'd tried, adding numbers beside each name. 12. 12 places in 3 days. No calls. No interviews. Just forms and blank spaces and doors that didn't open. I tried a hotel next. Janitorial position. The woman at the front desk was polite but firm. They required background checks. She handed me an online link. I didn't have internet. I didn't have a computer. I asked if there was a printed version. She gave me a look I couldn't name, half pity, half confusion, and said everything was digital now. I left. That evening, I ended up at the library. It was the only place that felt neutral, a kind of waiting room between the world I had left and the world I had entered. I sat at a public computer and tried to navigate the job listings. The mouse felt slippery in my hand. The monitor was too bright. The job sites demanded logins and email addresses and digital resumes. I didn't have any of those. I asked the librarian for help. She was kind, patient. She helped me create an email, helped me draft a resume from memory, even though most of the dates I gave her were estimates. She saved it to a flash drive I couldn't afford to buy. She let me use one from the lost and found. I said, "Thank you." I meant it. Armed with the digital version of my life, I tried again. Applications, uploads, forms. Every time I checked the box for felony convictions, I imagined the rejection being automated, sent to a server that filtered out men like me before anyone ever read a word. That night, in the shelter, someone stole the folder with my hard copies. Gone. I told the intake worker. He shrugged. No cameras. Nothing to be done. I didn't even have the energy to be angry. I lay on my cot, stared at the ceiling, and listened to the coughs and snores and quiet sobs around me. The next morning I started again. Another street, another place. I tried a grocery store. The manager looked tired. He asked if I had reliable transportation. I said I walked. He said they needed someone who could cover multiple locations. I nodded and left. On the walk back, I got caught in a sudden downpour. The sky opened up without warning, soaking me through in minutes. I stood under an awning and waited. Water pooled in the street, trash swirling in the gutters. I watched it all like someone watching a film they didn't understand. I thought about turning back, thought about the prison, the routine, the walls, the simplicity of being told when to sleep, when to eat, when to stand. But I didn't go back. I kept walking. Each day blurred into the next, stitched together by blisters and rejections. I began to recognize the smells of certain blocks, the hot oil behind the diner, the rotting fruit behind the grocery, the bleach from the janitorial supply depot. I learned where to get water, where to sit unnoticed, which corners to avoid after dark. The city never softened. It remained a labyrinth of closed doors and invisible rules. But I walked it anyway, day after day, not because I believed it would welcome me, but because I didn't know how to stop moving. Forward was all I had left. At night I returned to the shelter, my feet sore, my head empty. I laid down without speaking, stared into the darkness, and wondered how many more corners I would turn before something opened. Or if the maze had no exit at all. The sign above the restaurant door was half burnt out, with only the letters Alma's Dine still flickering in red. It was tucked between a laundromat and a payday loan store, like most places I'd been circling since my release. The front looked like the kind of place regulars went not for the food, but because they had nowhere else to be. I found it by accident, or maybe by fatigue. My feet were raw from walking, my stomach hollowed out from another missed lunch, and the clouds overhead looked ready to collapse. The alley behind the diner was narrow and slick with grease. There were a few rusting metal bins, crates stacked unevenly, and an overflowing dumpster buzzing with flies. The back door was propped open with a dented milk crate, and inside I could see steam curling through the doorway. It smelled of burnt oil, bleach, and faintly of onions. The kind of smell that clung to your clothes and hair and told everyone where you worked before you said a word. I didn't walk through the front. I stood outside the back door until someone noticed. A man in a hairnet, maybe 40, appeared in the doorway holding a tray of empty glasses. He looked me over quickly, then disappeared inside. For a moment I thought that was the end of it, but a minute later he came back and handed me a paper towel to dry my hands and a white apron that smelled like boiled cabbage. No one asked my name. No one cared about my record. I didn't need to fill out a form or check a box about felonies. I was given a place behind the sink and a pile of dishes, and for the first time since stepping outside the walls, someone expected me to stay. The dish pit was the size of a closet. Steam rose from the industrial sink, thick enough to wet the walls. The floor was slippery, and the drains gurgled like old lungs. I didn't mind. I worked the way I'd always worked, quiet, steady, methodical. I organized the trays by size, rinsed, scrubbed, stacked. My hands remembered the rhythm long before my mind did. The noise helped. The clatter of plates, the hiss of fryers, the bark of cooks, the occasional crash followed by swearing. It was a symphony of function, and I was one piece of it. My clothes stuck to me, soaked with sweat and dishwater. I didn't care. I had known worse conditions. I had lived in worse smells. There was a sort of dignity in the repetition. Each plate cleaned was a task completed. A simple thing, a concrete thing. Nothing abstract about a dirty plate made clean. The others in the kitchen didn't talk much to me. A few nods, one slap on the back at the end of the shift. No names, no questions. That suited me. I didn't have stories to share. Nothing they'd want to hear. At the end of the night, I peeled off the apron and left it draped over the corner of a stool. My shoulders ached. My lower back throbbed. I hadn't stood that long in years, but I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. Tired in a way that meant I'd done something, not just survived. The owner, a woman with short gray hair and a cigarette always clinging to the edge of her lip, handed me a folded stack of bills. Small, wrinkled. She didn't count it, and neither did I. I nodded. She nodded back. It wasn't a handshake kind of place. It wasn't a thank you kind of place either. It was a keep your head down and show up again, tomorrow kind of place. And I could do that. I had done harder things for no reward at all. I walked home through the dark, the air cooling against my damp shirt. The streets were quieter now. The stores had closed, and the traffic was thinning. I passed under flickering streetlights and kept my hand in my pocket, fingers clenched around the small roll of cash. I hadn't held money in over 40 years, not real money, not my own. At the shelter, I waited in line with the rest. They handed out soup and a chunk of cornbread. I ate in silence, watching a cockroach crawl along the wall behind the microwave. No one swatted it. We were all too tired. In my room, I sat on the edge of the cot and unfolded the bills. $36, a 10, a 20 and 6 ones. I spread them out on the blanket like they were something holy. They smelled faintly of grease and flour and someone's cheap cologne. I stared at them a long time. Then I reached under the cot and pulled out the worn envelope that held the rest of my things. The photograph, the folded release papers, the scratchy pencil I used to keep notes. I added the money to it, sealed it again, tucked it beneath the mattress. That night, I didn't lie awake listening to the silence. I fell asleep fast and deep, the ache in my muscles lulling me into something close to peace. Not joy, not happiness, just quiet. The next morning, I woke before the alarm and washed up in the cracked sink down the hall. I put on the same clothes, wiped off the worst of the stains, and walked back toward the diner. The sun was just beginning to rise. I passed the same bus stops, the same broken sidewalk tiles, the same closed storefronts. But this time, I wasn't wandering. I knew where I was going. When I reached the back door, it was already propped open. Steam rolled out, thick and warm. I stepped inside, tied on the apron, and went to work. No questions, no promises, just the sound of water and dishes and the steady beat of something beginning again. It started with a name, a first name, and a last, printed on a faded envelope I had kept folded inside the lining of my shoe for over a decade. That envelope had made its way through prison mailrooms, across 2 transfers, and into my property bag when I was released. I didn't even know if the address was still valid, but it was something, a direction to follow when everything else in my life had been reduced to forms and soup kitchens and a broken mattress. I found the public library again and sat at one of the terminals, my hands stiff on the keyboard. The address turned up quickly. An online listing, a satellite image, a map I could print for 10 cents. I stared at the house on the screen for a long time. It was just a roof, a driveway, a trimmed lawn, a tree with yellowing leaves in the yard. But it was more than that. It was a point on the earth where my son lived. Anton. I folded the paper carefully and kept it in my front pocket for 3 days before I did anything with it. When I finally went, I didn't take a bus. I walked. It took me most of the day. The house was in the northeast part of the city, in a neighborhood that didn't have boarded windows or broken sidewalks. The lawns were green. The fences were painted. There were signs for dog walking services and tutoring pinned to lampposts. The kind of place where people waved to each other and knew their mailman's name. I reached the corner just before dusk. The sun hung low, casting everything in gold. I didn't cross the street. I stood on the opposite sidewalk, half hidden behind a hedge, my hands in my jacket pockets. The air smelled like cut grass and barbecued chicken. His house was 2 stories, pale gray siding, dark shutters, a porch swing that swayed a little in the breeze. There was a silver SUV in the driveway, and a row of potted plants by the front steps. The door was open, a screen keeping out the bugs. Inside, I saw a light move across the ceiling. Then I saw him. Anton stepped into view, carrying something that looked like a casserole dish. He had broad shoulders, short cropped hair, a careful way of walking. His shirt was tucked in. He set the dish on the dining table and disappeared again. I froze. My breath caught somewhere deep in my chest. He didn't look like the boy in the photograph anymore. He looked like a man, someone the world would listen to, someone who had never needed a father. A moment later, a woman appeared. She was laughing, wiping her hands on a towel. She said something to someone off camera and walked over to adjust the blinds. I assumed she was his wife. She had kind eyes, a quick grace in her movements. She seemed comfortable there, at ease in her own kitchen. Then another figure came into view. A girl, maybe 12 or 13, in a yellow hoodie. She carried a stack of plates and placed them on the table with the kind of casual familiarity that comes from growing up in the same house all your life. She paused to peek out the window, and for a second I thought her eyes met mine. But she turned away, unfazed, and sat down at the table. I watched them gather, one by one, a family in motion. They passed food. They talked. They laughed. I couldn't hear any of it, but I saw everything. The way Anton tilted his head when he listened. The way he poured his daughter a glass of water without asking. The way his wife leaned toward him when she spoke. It was a life. A whole life built in the absence I had left behind. I stood there until my legs ached and my throat felt tight. I didn't know what I had expected. Certainly not this. I hadn't pictured the laughter, the comfort, the quiet rituals of a Thursday evening dinner. I hadn't imagined how full his life would be without me in it. I didn't move closer. I didn't step off the curb. I just stood like a ghost at the edge of his world, watching something I couldn't touch. A car drove past me, slowly, and I turned my head away, pretending to study the cracks in the sidewalk. When it was gone, I looked back. The porch light had come on. The windows glowed. The sky was turning violet, and the first stars began to flicker in the distance. I felt old. Not the kind of old you feel in your knees or your spine. The kind of old that settles in your chest. The kind that comes from watching something pass you by and knowing it will never return. Time had moved on without me, as it should have. But standing there, I felt like I was standing in a museum of a life that could have been mine if I hadn't taken the path I did. I stayed until the lights in the kitchen turned off, then the living room, then the upstairs. Slowly, one by one, the house dimmed until it was just the porch light glowing in the dark. Only then did I turn and walk away. The streets were quieter on the way back. Fewer cars, fewer people, just the sound of my own footsteps and the rustle of leaves. I didn't cry. I didn't shake my fist at the sky or curse the years I'd lost. I just walked with a kind of stillness I hadn't known before. At one point, I stopped at a small park bench and sat down. I pulled out the map again, but I didn't look at the house. I folded it back up and placed it inside my jacket, close to my chest. That night, in the shelter, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I could still see their silhouettes at the table, the soft halo of light, the movement of hands, the quiet choreography of belonging. I was the man on the other side of the street, and that was all I could be. The park was one of the few places in the city where I didn't feel completely out of place. It was quiet in the mornings, just after sunrise, before the joggers came with their headphones and energy drinks, before the mothers showed up pushing strollers with wheels cleaner than my shoes. It had an old stone fountain at the center that hadn't worked in years, and a scattering of benches worn smooth by time and weather. I claimed the one farthest from the path, under the crooked limbs of a sycamore tree, where the birds gathered in the early light, and the breeze still smelled faintly of cut grass. On my lunch break, I would take a plastic-wrapped sandwich, always the same, peanut butter and stale white bread, and sit there with a can of lukewarm coffee from the diner's machine. I wasn't supposed to leave the back lot, but no one checked. No one cared. I was invisible to most of them, a pair of dishwater hands attached to an aging frame they didn't bother to know. That particular day, the park was unusually empty. Overcast skies kept most people inside. I welcomed the gray. It suited me. I unwrapped the sandwich, took slow bites, and watched the squirrels dart around the roots of the trees. Everything was calm, dull, ordinary. Until I heard a familiar voice. Not the words, not at first, just the cadence, the rhythm, the unmistakable lilt of someone I hadn't heard in decades. I froze. I didn't turn around right away. I kept chewing, slow and mechanical, but my jaw had gone stiff. Then the voice spoke again, closer this time, and I turned my head. He was thinner than I remembered, his face weathered, jaw sunken, clothes mismatched and wrinkled. His eyes had the jittery look of someone who'd never found steady ground. And yet, I knew him instantly. You don't forget the man who stood beside you when your life unraveled. His name was Ray. He had been my partner the night it all happened. The one who convinced me the job was quick and clean. The one who said the place would be empty. The one who ran when it wasn't. He hadn't pulled the trigger either, but he was there, just like I was. We both heard the sound. We both saw the body fall. But when the sirens came, only one of us stayed behind. Now he stood in front of me like some twisted mirror. His hands were shaking, maybe from age, maybe from nerves, maybe from whatever he'd put in his body that morning. He looked me up and down, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. Then he grinned. That grin brought back 100 memories I didn't want. He sat beside me uninvited, leaning back like we were just two old friends bumping into each other by chance. He started talking, and I let the words wash over me without really listening. He talked about the past, like it was some war story, like it was a thing to laugh at. He used that same slang we used when we were 25 and stupid. Names of people I hadn't thought about in years tumbled from his mouth, each one a brick from a wall I had spent half my life trying to dismantle. He remembered everything in vivid, distorted detail. The getaway car, the safe we never opened, the panic, the sirens, the way we split up. He talked about it like it was folklore, like it was some wild night from youth that didn't end with a man bleeding out on the floor of a liquor store. I didn't say much. I nodded a few times, sipped my coffee, watched the birds instead of his face. But inside, I felt something twisting. My gut clenched. My chest grew tight. My palms began to sweat. The part of me that had spent 40 years trying to make peace with the truth was now sitting next to the man who had run from it. He said he'd done time too. Not for the same thing. Petty charges, drug stuff, in and out. Never long enough to get clean. Never long enough to get scared. He made it sound like a game he kept losing on purpose. I looked at his hands. They were scabbed, fingernails yellowed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, offered me one. I shook my head. He lit one anyway and blew the smoke sideways like he was being polite. He asked what I was doing now. I told him the truth, washing dishes, getting by. He laughed and said something about how at least we were both out, free men, making it work. But I didn't feel free, not sitting there beside him. I felt caged in again. the way I had back then, when we drove through the night with the radio off and the stolen cash sweating through my jacket. I felt the same dread I'd felt standing over the man on the floor, realizing nothing would ever be the same. Ray reached into his coat and pulled out a small bottle, took a swig, and offered it to me. I refused again. He chuckled and leaned back, his head tilted to the sky like he didn't have a care in the world. I stood up. He looked surprised. He asked if I was in a hurry. I said nothing, just nodded at the bench like I was thanking it, and walked away. I could feel his eyes on my back the entire time. The rest of the day, the air felt heavier. At the diner, the clatter of plates seemed louder. The heat from the sink stung more. My hands trembled under the stream. I dropped a glass and it shattered in the basin. No one said anything. I cleaned it up and kept going. That night, I didn't go back to the shelter right away. I walked through the neighborhood aimlessly, not looking at signs or people. I needed the distance, the silence, the space to breathe without hearing his voice in my ear. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the cot and pulled the photograph from the envelope again. My hand lingered on the image of Anton, his smile frozen in time. I wondered if he ever looked at his reflection and thought of me. I wondered if he knew that the man who stood over his cradle in the dark had once shared blood with a man like Ray. I closed my eyes and saw the shop again, the red of the linoleum, the glint of the gun, the expression on the clerk's face as he fell. I heard the footsteps of Ray vanishing into the alley, the sirens rounding the corner, the weight of my own stillness as I stood, hands raised, already erasing who I had been. I wasn't angry at Ray. Not anymore. That feeling had dried up long ago, but seeing him reminded me of what I had buried, of who I had been before the cell, before the silence, before the memory of my son became the only thing that kept me upright. I lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling, the shadows flickering from the hallway light outside the door. He had called me brother once, a partner, a friend. But all I felt now was distance, 40 years of it, and the growing certainty that the only way forward was to keep walking, away from ghosts, away from shadows, away from men who never stayed. It was a Wednesday, late afternoon, the kind of day when the air starts to cool just enough to remind you summer doesn't last forever. I had just finished another shift at the diner, my apron rolled up in my bag, my feet sore from standing too long in shoes that didn't fit quite right. I walked the usual route back toward the shelter, past the liquor store with the cracked neon sign, past the barber shop that never seemed to be open, past the convenience store where I sometimes bought a hard-boiled egg and a bottle of water for dinner. I wasn't in a hurry. I rarely was anymore. When you've lost most of your life, minutes stop feeling urgent. I reached the small park by accident, or maybe by muscle memory. It had become my place of pause, a midpoint between the noise of the kitchen and the silence of the room I slept in. I sat down on the bench under the same sycamore tree, wiped my hands on my jeans, and leaned forward, elbows on my knees, watching the wind stir the dry leaves on the ground. That's when I saw her. She was standing near the edge of the fountain, holding a drink in a plastic cup, her backpack slung low on one shoulder. She had the posture of someone who didn't yet know the weight of years, but carried something older in her eyes. There was a hesitation in her movements, a kind of deliberate stillness, as if she were waiting for someone to notice her. Her hoodie was bright yellow, the kind of yellow that didn't exist when I was a child. Artificial, loud, and yet on her, it looked like it belonged. I didn't recognize her at first, not really, but something about the way she stood, the tilt of her head, the way she looked around with narrowed eyes. There was something familiar in it. I kept watching. I didn't stare, didn't move. I just sat, breathing slowly, letting the moment build its own weight. She turned. Our eyes met, And in that instant, I knew. She didn't run. She didn't look away. She didn't shout or wave or speak. She just took a sip from her drink and walked toward me. Calm, measured, like this was something she had rehearsed. She stopped a few feet away and studied me. Her eyes were green, sharp, filled with the kind of awareness I had only seen in people who had already learned how to read a room before entering it. I recognized that instinct. I had lived by it. She said nothing, and neither did I. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was thick with unasked questions. Eventually, she sat on the bench beside me. Not close, but not distant either. Just enough to acknowledge something had passed between us. Some recognition, some understanding. I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out like ridges on old wood. I folded them together and waited. She tapped her sneaker against the concrete in slow rhythm, then pulled a folded piece of notebook paper from her back pocket and held it in her lap. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I knew whatever it said wasn't for me to read. It was a prop, a decoy, something to hold while she figured out what she really wanted. She asked me a question, not with words, but with her posture, her presence, the way she tilted her head slightly toward me. It was the question I had feared and hoped for all at once. "Who are you?" I didn't answer directly. I just breathed, deep and quiet. And in that breath, I offered everything I could. I was the man who had disappeared, the one who had been erased, the one she had seen standing across the street, outside the light of her windows. I was the shadow in the corner of her life. And now, suddenly, I was real. She didn't flinch. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. Not in approval, not in forgiveness, just in acknowledgement. A gesture that said, "I see you. You are not invisible." We sat like that for a long time. People came and went. A man walked his dog. A pair of teenagers passed on skateboards, laughing. A mother pushed a stroller, humming a tune under her breath. The world didn't care about our bench, our silence, our fragile connection. And maybe that was what made it possible. Eventually, she stood. She didn't look at me when she did, just stared ahead toward the path that led out of the park. She started to walk away, then stopped. She turned slightly and glanced back. Not fully, just enough for me to know this wasn't the end. That was the first time we met. The second came 2 days later. Same park, same bench. This time she sat without hesitation. She brought 2 sodas, set one beside me without a word. I opened it. It hissed. The third time, she brought a deck of cards. I didn't play. I just watched as she shuffled them and laid them out in rows like a magician preparing a trick she wouldn't explain. Little by little, these meetings became the only thing I looked forward to. I didn't tell anyone about them. Not at the shelter. Not at the diner. They were mine. A secret rhythm woven into the chaos of my days. She never asked why I left. She never asked what I had done. She never mentioned her father. It was as if she had created a separate world for us, one where names and crimes and years didn't exist, where the only thing that mattered was presence. She told me small things, bits of school, teachers she didn't like, a friend who had moved away, a dog she wanted but wasn't allowed to have. I listened. I memorized everything. Her name, I learned on the 4th meeting, was Katya. She said it quickly, as if testing the sound, as if unsure whether she should let me carry it. I carried it like a treasure. I didn't dare hope for more. I didn't dream of holidays or family dinners or forgiveness. I had no illusions about rebuilding what was never built in the first place. But these meetings, these quiet exchanges in a dusty park beneath a crooked tree, were something. A bridge, narrow and trembling, stretched over a chasm I had once believed impassable. One afternoon, it rained. She showed up anyway. We sat under the shelter near the basketball court. She wore a yellow raincoat too big for her, the hood sliding down over one eye. She laughed when the wind caught it. I didn't laugh, but I smiled. She noticed. That evening, as I walked back to the shelter in damp clothes, I felt something inside me shift. Not a healing, not a repair, just a breath of air in a place that had long gone still. She was the first person in decades who looked at me and didn't see a label, didn't see a number, didn't see a ghost. She saw a man on a bench who brought nothing but presence. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. The knock came hard and sudden, like the fist behind it belonged to someone who wasn't planning to wait. It rattled the thin wood of the shelter room's door and echoed through my spine before I even rose to my feet. I knew. I didn't need to look through the peephole or listen for a voice. I knew. I opened the door slowly, and there he was. Anton. My son stood in the hallway like a storm that had finally made landfall. His face wasn't the face from the photo I carried. It wasn't the face of the boy who once sat on my shoulders, legs kicking with joy. It wasn't even the man I had seen behind that warm family window. This face was older now, harder, sharpened by years I hadn't been allowed to witness. His jaw was clenched. His hands were fists. His eyes burned with something beyond anger. It was betrayal, confusion, rage that had waited too long and found no safe place to go. I stepped back, giving him room. He didn't come inside. He stood in the doorway, filling it with silence that screamed. For a moment I thought he might speak, that he might release all the questions and accusations boiling in his throat. But he didn't need words. His presence alone was enough to strip me bare. Then he reached into his coat and pulled something out. It was the photograph, the one I had given Katya. She had brought it home. He held it up, fingers trembling, and stared at me like I had committed the crime all over again. Then, without warning, he threw it. It hit the floor and slid beneath the narrow bed behind me. I didn't move. I let it stay there, resting where it had no business being. He stepped into the room then, not as a son, but as a judge. His movements were sharp, his breathing quick. He pointed at the cot, the peeling walls, the stained linoleum, as if to say, "This is what you are." Then he pointed at himself, his chest, as if to say, "This is what I became. You have no part in it." He paced once, turned, paced again. Still no words, only gestures, only the collapse of something unspoken that had held up whatever fragile possibility existed between us. He turned his gaze to me again, and this time, I saw more than anger. I saw fear, disgust, not of who I was, but of what I might become in his life if I stayed. He was protecting something, his wife, his daughter, his narrative, and I, simply by existing, had threatened it. He stepped closer, and I didn't move. I let the weight of his judgment fall. His mouth opened once, but whatever he intended to say, he swallowed it. Instead, he shook his head slowly, then pointed at the door, not as an invitation, but as an order. Go. Leave. Stay gone. My chest tightened, but I nodded. A slow, aching nod that came not from defeat, but from the understanding that I had reached the edge of the map. I had crossed a line without knowing it, and now I had to retreat. He left without another look. The door slammed behind him like a verdict. I stood in the center of the room, my hands trembling, my breath shallow. I turned and sat on the cot, the mattress sinking under me like a breath let out too fast. I stared at the floor, at the spot where the photograph had disappeared. I bent down, pulled it out. The image was bent now, creased through the middle. My hand hovered over it for a long time before I placed it gently on the nightstand, facing down. I didn't sleep that night, not because of noise, not because of fear, but because my mind kept replaying his face, The way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes narrowed, the way the silence between us said everything that words never could. In the morning, I left before dawn. I walked without purpose, past the old buildings, past the streets I had begun to recognize, past the diner where my shift would start hours later. I kept going. I needed distance. The city looked different, colder, sharper. The same buildings now felt like strangers. The same sidewalks rejected my footsteps. I reached a bridge, the kind cars drive over without ever seeing the people beneath. I sat on the edge, above the river, and watched the sun slowly rise over the rooftops. The water below moved slowly, thick with silt and time. I thought about jumping, not in the literal sense, but in the way old men do when their thoughts spiral into finalities, not as an act of drama, but as an exit, a surrender to the truth that maybe some wounds are meant to remain open. I stayed there until the sun was fully up, until the city stirred awake, until the wind shifted and reminded me of things I still hadn't done. Back at the diner, no one noticed the change. I washed the dishes the same way, scrubbed the pans, rinsed the trays, but my hands were heavier, slower. My shoulders sagged beneath a weight they couldn't name. The photograph stayed folded in my pocket for 3 days. Then I took it out, flattened it, and placed it inside a book I borrowed from the library. A book about bridges, structural integrity, design, collapse. I didn't see Katya again, not for a long time. The park felt hollow without her. I sat there anyway, every day, hoping, not expecting, not demanding, just hoping. And in that hope, I began to understand that the bridge we had built, she and I, was never meant to carry weight. It was a fragile thing, a thread across an abyss, and I had let it break. Now I waited. Not for forgiveness, not for return, just for the wind to settle. And maybe one day, for a footstep to sound beside mine once more. The room seemed smaller that night, as if the walls had crept in while I was gone. The ceiling pressed lower, the corners darker, the air heavier. I dropped my jacket on the edge of the cot and sat in the same spot I always did, elbows on knees, head in hands. I stared at the floor, but nothing was there to see, just stains and cracks and the ghost of something I couldn't name. Maybe disappointment, maybe shame. My hands shook, not from age, not from cold, from something deeper, from the weight of everything that had slipped through my fingers. I had always thought prison was bottom, that the cell, the sentence, the endless repetition of days was the worst a man could reach. But I was wrong. Rock bottom wasn't a place made of steel bars and concrete walls. It was silence, a silence so thick you couldn't breathe in it. A silence that came after your own blood looked you in the eye and told you that your existence was a problem. I lay back on the cot and stared at the water-stained ceiling. My eyes burned, but no tears came. The well had long since dried. My body was exhausted, but sleep refused to take me. I watched the minutes crawl by on the little digital clock by the bed, the red numbers pulsing like a wound that wouldn't close. At some point I got up and walked. No destination, no plan. I left the shelter and wandered the city with my hands in my pockets, head down, shoes scraping the sidewalk in slow, tired rhythm. The streets were mostly empty. A few cars rolled by with music leaking from open windows. A siren wailed in the distance, not close enough to mean anything. I passed closed shops, trash bins, alleys that reeked of urine and rot. I passed people like me, shadows hunched in doorways, curled on bus benches, invisible. I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going until I saw the bus station. It stood like a beacon of possibility, even at this hour. The terminal was quiet, just the low hum of vending machines and the occasional voice over the loudspeaker. The benches were hard plastic, the air stale, the lights too bright. But it was clean. It didn't judge. I walked to the schedule board. So many names of places I didn't know. Small towns, big cities, routes that stretched across deserts and mountains, rivers and plains. A map of escape printed in bold black letters. A map for people who still believed in starting over. I stood there a long time. I could buy a ticket. I had enough saved from the diner, just barely. I could disappear again, find a new city, a new shelter, a new sink to scrub. I could vanish as easily as I had returned, and no one would come looking. No one would stop me. Not my son, not his daughter, not the system. I was a ghost, and ghosts could move freely. I sat on one of the benches and watched a bus pull in. A few passengers got off, blinking under the fluorescent lights, dragging their bags like dead weight. No one smiled. No one looked up. I thought about stepping outside, lighting a cigarette I didn't have. I thought about the bridge, the park bench, the yellow hoodie, the girl with her guarded eyes and sharp silence. I thought about the photograph still tucked inside the book I hadn't returned to the library. And I stayed. Not because I didn't want to leave, but because leaving would mean surrendering the last piece of myself I had managed to reclaim. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I stayed until the sky outside began to pale, that strange hour before sunrise when everything feels suspended in a kind of breathless stillness. Then I stood up and walked out of the terminal. The cold hit me in the face like a warning. I didn't go back to the shelter. I wandered the city, half asleep until the diner opened. I stood in the alley beside the back door and waited for the prep cook to unlock it. When he saw me, he said nothing, just nodded, like always, and let me in. I washed dishes with the same tired rhythm. My hands cracked from the soap and heat. The steam clung to my skin. I broke 2 plates and caught a glare from the line cook, but no one said a word. I was just part of the background again. Familiar. Quiet. Later that afternoon, I went back to the park. The bench was empty. I sat. Hours passed. The wind picked up. The shadows grew long. Still no one. I stayed until the cold worked its way into my bones, and I could no longer feel my fingertips. Then I walked back to the room that waited for me, the same as always. The next morning, I did it again, and the morning after that, and the one after that. Because sometimes, when you hit bottom, the only thing left to do is wait. Not for rescue, not for redemption, but for the stillness to settle. And for the first sign, any sign, that you are still here, that you still belong, that the weight pressing on your chest isn't permanent. So I waited, and in the waiting, I began to breathe again. I sat at the narrow desk beneath the window in my room, a single sheet of lined paper in front of me, a dull pencil resting beside it. The air was still. The radiator hissed faintly in the corner, and outside, the wind moved through the alley like a memory that couldn't settle. I had spent the better part of the day walking without direction, as I often did, circling the same streets, avoiding the park, avoiding the library, avoiding myself. When I returned and closed the door behind me, there was a kind of finality in the way the latch clicked. I knew what I had to do. I pulled the chair out slowly and sat, letting my hands rest on the desk, palms flat. The surface was scratched, dented, stained from years of other men writing things they never sent. It felt appropriate. I looked down at the paper and thought about how long it had been since I wrote anything by hand. My fingers already ached at the thought. For a while I didn't move. I watched the pale evening light slide across the floor, watched a spider crawl up the edge of the window frame. I was waiting, though I didn't know for what. Perhaps for courage, perhaps for words. I wasn't writing for forgiveness. That much I understood. Forgiveness was a word too clean, too final. This was something else, a document of truth, a confession, A bridge I didn't expect anyone to walk across, but one I needed to build anyway. When I finally picked up the pencil, my hand trembled. The first line came slow, each letter deliberate, etched rather than written. Anton. Just his name. Nothing else at first. It looked foreign on the page, like I'd stolen it from someone else's life. I stared at it for a while before continuing. I wrote without structure, without plan. I let the memories come as they wanted. I wrote about the night, the one that ended it all. I described it not as an excuse, but as a sequence of facts. I didn't downplay what happened. I didn't rewrite the past. I didn't try to make it softer than it was. I told him that I didn't pull the trigger, but that I stood there. That I didn't run, but I didn't stop it either. That I lived with the weight of that moment every day for 40 years. I told him that the bars didn't punish me nearly as much as silence did. That the loss of his mother's voice was worse than the sound of a closing cell door. That the image of his face at 5 years old, reaching for a man who would not return, haunted me long after I stopped counting the days. I wrote about prison, not as a place, but as a state of mind. I described the years not in terms of time served, but in the things I missed. First steps I didn't see. Birthdays I didn't know. Graduations, Christmases, scraped knees, bedtime stories, broken bones, first loves, heartbreaks. All of it lost. All of it lived without me. I told him I didn't blame his mother, that I understood her choice, that if I'd been in her place, I might have done the same, that telling him I was dead was perhaps the only kindness she could offer. I wrote about the day I was released, the light, the heat, the colors that felt too sharp, the noise that pressed into my skin. I wrote about the job, the shelter, the benches, the coffee, the silence. I told him that I watched him through the window that evening, not because I was trying to intrude, but because I didn't know how to knock. Because I had become a man built entirely of hesitation. I wrote about Katya, not her name, never her name. I protected that. But I told him that someone found me in a park and didn't turn away, that for a brief time a thread had formed between two worlds. I didn't call it love or redemption or healing, just a thread, a fragile, quiet thing that asked for nothing and gave more than I deserved. I wrote that I understood his anger, that I had no expectations, that I wasn't asking for a place in his life or his house or his memory, that I only wanted him to know who I really was, not the ghost, not the myth, not the dead man from a lie told long ago. Just the man. The broken, flawed, aging man who once held him on his shoulders and whispered dreams into his ears. I wrote until my hand cramped and the pencil dulled to a smudge. I sharpened it with a razor from my bag, carefully, slowly, as though the act itself were sacred. I kept going. I told him that I had no legacy, no property, no grand wisdom to leave behind. Only this story, only this truth. That I had spent my life building walls, and now, in these last years, I was learning to leave doors open instead. By the time I finished, the paper was covered front and back, the lines uneven, the pressure changing with every sentence. It was not beautiful, it was not polished, but it was honest. I read it once, slowly, line by line. I didn't edit. I didn't cross anything out. I let it stand as it was. Then I folded it into thirds and slid it into an envelope. I didn't seal it right away. I held it in my hands for a long time, my thumbs tracing the crease. I didn't add a return address. I simply wrote his name. I wasn't even sure if the street number I had was current, but I had to try. I sealed the envelope and set it on the desk. In the morning, I left before the sun rose, before the hallway filled with footsteps and the shelter with noise. I walked the same streets I always did, but with a different weight in my chest. Not heavier, not lighter, just different. At the corner, I found a red mailbox bolted to the sidewalk, near a payphone that hadn't worked in years. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cold metal in my hand. Then I slid the envelope into the slot and listened to the soft thunk as it disappeared inside. I stepped back, hands in my coat pockets, and stared up at the sky. No birds, no sign, just gray clouds moving slowly across a pale canvas. But something had changed. Not the past, not the pain, but something. Something small. And maybe that was enough. The morning after I sent the letter, I woke before the alarm. The air in the room was still, too still, as if the entire building were holding its breath. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from another night of fractured sleep. Light was just beginning to bleed in around the edges of the curtain, casting everything in that soft, uncertain gray. I dressed without thinking, same shirt, same pants, same shoes by the door, and went down the hallway with the letter no longer in my pocket, but still pressing on my thoughts, like a stone resting on water. Outside, the street was quiet. The usual rhythm of honking horns and early deliveries hadn't started yet. The city felt paused, like a reel caught in its frame. I walked without direction, a habit that had formed into ritual, as familiar to me now as the sound of my own footsteps on uneven concrete. I passed the corner where the mailbox stood and glanced at it briefly, almost shyly, as if it might remember what I had fed into it. But it looked the same, rusting, bolted into the sidewalk, indifferent. The letter was gone now. It had entered another world, one I couldn't see or touch. I continued walking. The sky was heavy with the kind of clouds that never rained but always threatened to. It suited the way I felt. Not broken, not hopeful, just full. Full of everything unsaid and everything already said. Full of the weight. At the diner, the prep cook gave me a nod. I washed my hands at the sink and tied on my apron. The steam from the dish machine clouded the air immediately. I let it wrap around me like fog. The noise helped. The clatter, the splashing, the scrape of plates. All of it pushed the thoughts into the background for a little while. My hands worked on muscle memory. Soak, scrub, rinse, stack. Over and over again. A rhythm older than regret. But my mind wandered. Every so often I paused without meaning to, staring at the water pooling in the basin, watching a thin film of grease swirl around the drain like a question with no answer. I kept thinking about what it might be like for him to read it, whether he would open it at all, whether he would tear it in half or throw it into a drawer or leave it sitting untouched at the edge of a kitchen counter for days. Maybe he had already read it. Maybe he had already thrown it away. There was no way to know. And that was the hardest part. Not knowing. After my shift, I walked to the park again. The bench was empty. The air had grown colder, sharper. The trees were almost bare now, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward a sky that wouldn't look down. I sat in the usual spot and watched the squirrels dig in the dead leaves, burying what they hoped would last the winter. No one came. I didn't expect her to, but a small part of me, too stubborn or too foolish to be quiet, waited anyway. That evening, back at the shelter, I skipped dinner. I sat in the common room, surrounded by men who had their own ghosts, their own letters, their own silences. No one spoke. The television flickered in the corner, showing a news anchor mouthing words none of us cared to hear. I watched the shadows stretch along the floor, dark fingers growing longer as the night settled in. Later, in my room, I turned off the overhead light and left only the lamp by the bed. I pulled the book from beneath the mattress, the one with the photograph inside, still pressed between pages like a fragile relic. I didn't open it. I just held it in my lap, feeling the weight of it. I closed my eyes and tried to remember his voice, not as a man, not the sharp echo I'd heard in the hallway that day, but as a boy. as the child who once reached for me with sticky fingers and bright eyes, who once called me something softer than anything I'd heard since. But I couldn't summon it. Too many years had passed. The next few days moved slowly, the kind of slow where time becomes soft at the edges, blurring into itself like fog rolling across a window pane. I kept working, kept walking, kept sitting on the bench. No phone call came, no knock on the door, no letter in return. But something had shifted. Inside me. The tension I'd been carrying, not the kind you wear in your shoulders or in the back of your neck, but the kind that lives deep behind the ribs, had loosened, not vanished, not resolved, but loosened, like a knot beginning to come undone by time alone. I began to breathe differently. I noticed the small things again, the way the sun caught on a pigeon's wings, the way a leaf, curled and dry, skated down the sidewalk in tiny circles, the sound of a child laughing across the street, muffled but unmistakable. It was as if the world, which had grown so sharp and hollow after Anton's visit, had begun to make room for me again, not because it had changed, but because I had. One afternoon, I stopped by the library. I returned the book, finally. The woman at the counter scanned it without looking up. I waited, half hoping she would pause, pull something out, say that something had been left inside. But she didn't. She slid the book into a bin, and just like that, it was gone. I left feeling both emptier and lighter. Later that week, I received a package. It wasn't large, just a plain brown envelope with my name handwritten on the front, no return address. The handwriting wasn't familiar, but the moment I saw it, my chest tightened. I carried it to my room and sat on the edge of the bed before opening it. Inside was the photograph, the same one I had mailed to Katya, the same one Anton had thrown to the floor. Only now it was framed. A simple wooden frame, nothing ornate, nothing expensive, but deliberate, gentle. Behind the photograph, folded neatly, was a piece of blank paper. No message, no explanation, just a gesture, a small, quiet gesture. I set the frame on the nightstand beside the lamp and sat staring at it for a long time. The silence in the room felt different that night. Not hollow, not heavy, but full. Full of everything that hadn't been said, but had finally been heard. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but held. And in that silence, I understood that sometimes healing doesn't come with words or answers. Sometimes it comes with space, with stillness, with the absence of rage, with the return of a photograph now held behind glass as if to say, "This still matters. This was not the end, only the pause after the storm." I arrived early that day. The sky was still a dull silver, the kind of gray that hadn't yet decided whether it would rain. The trees were mostly bare now, just a few stubborn leaves clinging to the branches like old memories. The grass was yellowing, and the wind carried a chill that slipped through the seams of my coat, but I didn't mind. I had grown used to the cold. There was something clean about it, something honest. The bench waited for me beneath the sycamore tree, the one that had quietly become my witness. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching the fountain. It hadn't worked in years, but still, people came. They sat on the rim, leaned against it, let their children climb its dry base like a relic from another time. I watched the pigeons strut between cracks in the concrete, pecking at invisible crumbs. The world moved slowly around me, unaware, unbothered. It had been days since the envelope arrived. Days since I found the photograph returned to me, framed now, protected behind glass. I hadn't heard anything else since. No calls, no notes, no visit, just that small, silent offering. And yet it had changed everything. Not with words, but with presence. It had loosened something in me I didn't know could still be loosened. I had stopped waiting for resolution. I had stopped needing it. Now I came here not out of hope, but out of ritual. There was comfort in the routine, in the stillness, in the way the world breathed without asking anything of me. The bench beside mine was empty. It usually was. Occasionally someone would pass through. An old woman feeding birds, a man in a suit on his phone, a teenager with a skateboard, but they never stayed long. They came and went like thoughts I couldn't hold on to. I didn't speak. I didn't expect anything. I simply sat, day after day, letting the minutes pass through me like water through cupped hands. That morning, I had brought 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one for no one in particular. I set it on the bench beside mine, steam rising into the cool air, and watched it until it stopped. The first time I noticed the figure, I thought it was a stranger, just another passerby. The way he moved, deliberate, steady, hesitant, was unfamiliar. He wore a dark coat, collar turned up against the wind. His hands were tucked into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. He didn't look at me at first, just kept walking along the path, eyes scanning the trees as though searching for something that wasn't there. Then he slowed. He turned. Our eyes met. Anton. He didn't say anything. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stopped and stood there for a long moment, looking at me, as if trying to decide whether I was real. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just looked back, letting the quiet between us speak for itself. After a few seconds that felt like the end of a season, he walked toward the bench. Not quickly, not with certainty, but without turning away. When he reached it, he didn't sit beside me. He sat on the other bench, the one with the second cup of coffee. He reached for it without a word and held it in both hands, as though testing its warmth, as though deciding whether it was truly meant for him. We sat like that. No sound but the rustling of dry leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the faint grind of tires against pavement beyond the trees. He didn't look at me again, and I didn't press. Minutes passed, 5, 10, maybe more. A breeze lifted the edge of his coat and brushed against my sleeve, light as breath. He sipped the coffee. I did the same. We stared ahead, not at each other. There was no need. Presence was enough. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not peace. Something smaller, but deeper. Acceptance. We didn't talk. There was nothing left to say. Everything that could be said had already been written, read, returned. What remained was this: 2 men, bound by time and blood and silence, sitting on opposite benches, holding warm coffee in cold hands, watching the world go by. Not forgiveness, not reunion, but something that existed quietly between those things. A beginning. Or maybe just an end that didn't hurt. The sun broke through the clouds briefly, casting thin lines of gold across the stone of the fountain. Anton stood first. He left the cup on the bench, stood for a moment, then walked away the same way he came. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. And neither did I. I sat for a while longer, watching the steam fade from his cup. Then I picked it up, held it in my hands, and smiled. Not because I was healed, not because I was whole, but because I was seen. And sometimes, that was enough.